What's up guys, it's Mitch here from the DIYRecordingStudio.com, and today we're looking at part 2 of a compression basics video where we go over some of the basic functionalities of how compressors work and some of the tips and tricks you might need to know when using them in a mix. So welcome back to the channel guys, and thanks once again to everyone that has recently subscribed to the channel. I know it's really a small channel at the moment, but it's great to see new people coming in and subscribing, and it's really appreciated. It makes all the effort I put into these videos so worth it. So thanks once again. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe down below. And today we're going to be having a look at some more tips to do with compression in a mix. So last week we tried to demystify and debunk a whole heap of misconceptions about how compressors really work and what they're really doing in a mix and how they really should be approached, especially in the early stages of a mix. And today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that because there's a bit of theory and audio terminology and audio theory that you need to know before you can really start using compressors effectively. And I think this is where a lot of people go wrong when they first start using compressors in a mix, because in reality a compressor is really doing two things, and that's besides what we talked about last week, where a compressor is decreasing the dynamic range of the sound source that you send to it. It's also doing two other things to that waveform. And the first thing that it's doing is what we call envelope shaping. And if you've not heard the term envelope before, this might be new to you, but bear with me, I'll explain it as best as I can. But basically, envelopes are to do with something we looked at last week called transients. So let's dive into our Cubase session from last week and discuss transients again, and then we'll elaborate further onto what a sound envelope actually is. All right, so if we look at our kick drum here, we've got our previous work that we did last week, which was we had our original kick drum here, and then we had our compressed kick drum here. Okay, and each one of these spikes that you can see, or what we call transients. Okay, so each one of these little peaks are what we call transients. And I'll zoom in on that for a sec. Okay, every one of these is a transient. Okay, and what we can see is that when we compressed our signal, we reduced the dynamic range of these transients. Last week, that's exactly what we did. Okay, so some of the louder transients were turned down, and some of the quieter transients were turned up. So we end up with this compressed kick drum here, where all the transients are looking a little more even. And that just keeps a constant pulse through the music and allows the kick drum to always be pumping through the mix where we want it. So it's nice and up front in the mix and heard. Okay, so, but what we need to look at today is what a sound envelope is. And if you've ever used a synthesizer, you might have heard the term envelope before, or you might have even heard of the term envelope shaper. Okay, but really what a compressor is an envelope shaper. So we've removed that track and we've just got our original kick drum. And as we zoom in, we have the initial part of our kick that we can see here, the initial transient. And as we zoom out, that's the part we see as a spike, okay, or a peak. Okay, but that's the transient. Alrighty. Now, a kick drum is actually a really easy way to talk about what we call the sound envelope, or the ADSR. Okay, and I'm going to show you, bring up an image on what that is. And we have it here. Okay, ADSR, the ADSR envelope. Okay, and what that means is 4 different terms, and they are attack, decay, sustain, and release. ADSR. Okay. This is one of my favorite images because it kind of tells you a lot of the things you need to know about what a sound envelope is, and that will help us use compressors much more effectively. Okay, so we see here, time we are taking from 0 to max amplitude is the attack. Great definition there. The decay follows directly after the attack. Time the amplitude takes to go from a maximum level to the sustained level. Okay. The sustain is the level of amplitude we are keeping as long as the key is pressed, it says here, but that could be on a guitar as long as the string is plucked, okay, or let to vibrate, or on a kick drum, how long that body of the drum rings out for, okay? And then the release starts as soon as the note is released, okay? and the amplitude goes from sustain down to 1. So some of the terminology here where it says keys, we're talking about piano or synthesizers, but it applies also to any acoustic instrument you play as well. They all have an attack, a decay, a sustain, and a release. Okay, ADSR. And very, very important to know that that's what an envelope is. And that's really the first part of what a compressor is manipulating. So ADSR, that is the first part of the manipulation of the sound source that we are talking about today. Last week we talked about the dynamic range and how a compressor affects that. And today we're going to be talking about ADSR, and then we've got another thing we're going to talk about in a minute. But let's just stay on ADSR for now. So let's look at our kick drum and apply that ADSR terminology to our kick drum waveform. All right, so if we look here, we can see here, the peak starts here and it reaches its maximum amplitude right here. So there to there would be our attack. Okay, then I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. We've definitely got our decay as the signal gets softer, which happens pretty quickly. Okay, so the attack and decay are quite quick on a kick drum. But then we've got all of this here where the note is sustained. Okay, along here. All right. And then we start to get from here, we've got this definite sustained amplitude here where the peaks all seem about the same. And then we've got our decay where it starts to reach towards 0. Okay, so attack, decay, sustain, and then the release. Okay. And the reason why you need to understand that is because the parameters of a compressor actually work within those terms. So if you remember back to last week, some of the functions and the parameters that you can use on a compressor are called attack and release. All right. And that's because they will work within those certain parameters, but they can also, on top of that, reshape those parameters. And that's where we get to the point that a compressor is actually affecting what we call the timbre of an instrument, because the timbre of an instrument is made up of two things. And I love this definition. We'll have a look here. And you might have heard the term timbre before, and you might not have, but the timbre of an instrument is basically the quality of its sound. Some people refer to it as tone color or tone or any of these kind of things. The easiest way to think of it is if I play an A note on a guitar and I play the exact same A note and the same octave on a piano, why do they sound different? It's because of the timbre. And the timbre is two different things. It's the first thing we just looked at, okay? The primary contributors to the quality of timbre of the sound of musical instruments are harmonic content, attack, and decay, and they also add in vibrato. Attack and decay are to do with our ADSR, our envelope. Okay, so attack and decay, they're really just talking about the ADSR, and it is really all about those four parts, not just the two, not just attack and decay, but attack, decay, sustain, and release. That's part of the timbre. And then it's also about something we call harmonic content. And what you might not know is that what makes each instrument different is that when an instrument is played, the fundamental note is the note we hear. Say it's A, okay? Say we're playing the A note on a guitar. So that might be at A440, which is A440 hertz, okay? But we don't need to get into that. All you need to understand is that when you play an A note, it has the fundamental frequency that's played, and it has a whole bunch of other frequencies called the harmonics that resonate with that note due to what the instrument is made out of, what the string or whatever is being plucked, and what it is being plucked with. So everything physical about that instrument dictates what extra harmonics and what volume they are heard at. So that changes the timbre between a guitar and a piano, or a piano and a violin, or brass, or any other instrument. They can all play the same note, but they sound very different. And it's all just to do with these extra harmonics. Now, what does that have to do with compressors? The second thing that compressors start to do to our audio signal is add harmonics. They all do this in their own way. They definitely start to add or bring up certain harmonic frequencies. So in effect, the compressor is not just lowering dynamic range, okay, like we looked at last week. It is also altering the timbre of that instrument. It alters the sound envelope, and it also alters the harmonics. And they do this by either adding harmonics through distortions, like say the distressor compressor definitely adds extra harmonics if we want it to, or certain tube compressors also do the same thing. And it's the same with different transformer-based compressors. They all add their own harmonics and coloration and therefore are affecting the timbre of that instrument. And this is something that goes really untalked about when we're talking about using compressors in mixes, that you effectively, every time you put a compressor on a sound source, it is changing the timbre. So let's have a look at how we can actually do that in a mix. And let's keep it simple. We'll start with the kick drum, and then we might look at the same thing with a vocal. So we've got our kick drum, and we've got a whole heap of different compressors that we have access to. And the first one I'd like to look at is the arouser compressor, which is a replica of the famous distressor compressor by Empirical Labs. Okay, great compressor. The reason why I want to look at this first is because as a compressor, this one features a lot of the envelope shaping parameters that we're talking about. So what we've got here is the input, okay, and this dictates once again at what volume what amplitude the compressor will start to activate. Okay, so if we go back to our waveform, all right, if we want it to activate on this kick drum, we need to get the input to be hitting around this high level of amplitude if that's what we want it to bring down the dynamic range of. So you are telling the compressor at which point of that signal you want it to start grabbing the kick drum. So that's our input, but then we've also got these other parameters, namely attack, okay, and release. Now, of course, they are the biggest part of the timbre, okay? Now, the release is the other part of the ADSR envelope that we're talking about. So it's telling the compressor how long to hold on to the signal. Once it's reached the attack, it's then going to hold on to it for as long as you set it, okay? So therefore, it'll keep the sustain and the release going for longer as long as you set this at a slower setting. Okay, and then after that, we can also turn the volume of the signal back up if we wanted to keep it at the same level it was at previously in the mix, which is what we'll typically do. And then on top of that, you've got the ratio, which we talked about last week, and that will actually bring the transient more aggressively down. So it'll actually shape the attack. So once again, you're affecting that part of the timbre of the instrument. So let's just have a quick look at that with some mild compression and have a listen to what the envelope shaping of the compressor really does. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start increasing the attack. Let's turn it up a little bit. All right, so if we set our attack too slow, we start to see that the compressor doesn't even grab any of it because it's too slow to even grab any of the kick drum before the next kick drum comes in. But if we drag that back, and as we make it the attack much faster, we start to hear it bringing down that first transient. This compressor is a very interesting one because it can be quite fast. So it can grab that transient very quickly, all right? And then we can get the compressor to hold on to that for as long as we want. So let's have a look at that. So that's a fast attack and release. Let's hold on to it for much longer. And And then what we're going to do is bypass it and make sure we get the same output level, just so we can hear what it's really doing. Now, when I get it to be at the right sort of slowness, you'll start to hear that the initial attack is being brought down, but the sustained part of that kick drum that we looked at earlier is actually being held onto and turned up. So effectively, we are manipulating the envelope, the sound envelope, by bringing the attack, the initial transient down, and then increasing the volume of the sustained part. So let's have a listen again. And what that effectively does, by bringing down the initial transient, it removes some of the attackiness of that kick drum, and then by holding on to the resonant frequencies that happen later on in the kick drum, it turns them up and makes it sound a bit bigger and beefier, and you get more of that low end. So you can change the timbre of a kick drum by affecting the ADSR of that kick drum, okay, the sound envelope. So what we'll do is we'll have that compressor on, and we'll export, and we'll see how different that ADSR becomes. All right, so the first thing that I can see is that right here, this peak on the original kick drum is now being flattened and also held out a little bit longer, okay? There's less just initial peak, and it's much more upfront, okay? So you can see that instead of this curvature here and curvature there on that initial amplitude, so the kick drum, we just get much more sort of instantaneous peaks there. All right. And then what we can also see is that some of the decay here, especially as it gets a lot lower down this end, is a lot louder. And the compressor is definitely holding on to more amplitude in the decay and in the release of that signal. And then over here, you can see what it's done as well is turn up some of our spill, okay? Which might be a good or bad thing, depending on what you're trying to do. All right. But the main thing that it's done here, it's altered the attack and the decay. You can see that pretty obviously here. The attack and the decay have both been altered. And then we've also got the sustain and the release. Typically, the release is being altered quite a fair bit as well because it's much louder here and here. Okay, and that's going to affect how we hear that kick drum in the mix. So let's have a listen to the original compressor, and we'll just make sure that's off. Okay. So we've got no compression whatsoever on this kick drum. So in that, we can hear the dynamic range changing a fair bit. There's a lot of front end attack, the beater of the kick drum. But let's have a listen to our new version. Let's compare them. Cool. So in the new version, we're definitely getting more of the low end of the kick drum and losing some of that transient information, the initial beater of it. Whereas the original one, we're getting a much more attacky kind of front up sort of kick drum there, much more beater. And I mean, obviously it's up to you on which one you prefer. But really what we're just trying to look at, I don't think either of these is a good example of a good sounding kick drum quite yet, but basically, what I'm trying to show you is that you can completely change the timbre of an instrument by changing the ADSR of it. Now, an interesting thing you can do with the distressor compressor is actually change the harmonics even further, because it has this thing called THD built into the circuitry, and THD stands for total harmonic distortion, okay? So it uses distortion to create harmonics. Now, what did we talk about was the second thing that compressors do that are going to change the timbre? Harmonics. Okay, so let's go into our original kick drum. All right, we'll turn the distressor compressor on. And what we can do is add this dial here, and we'll get more percentage of total harmonic distortion. All right, and interestingly, it even has this little waveform here where things are being smoothed out. And that's because as you start to distort stuff or add distortion, everything gets smoothed, kind of. Anyway, that's something for another video. But yeah, it's kind of basically just saying like you're going to change the envelope and the timbre of an instrument by adding this stuff in. Okay, it will change the waveform. And as we oversaturate, we start to hear it really pulling down a lot of the information in that kick drum, but let's just distort it a little bit. Turn it off. Now, right now, I've got this compressor set really fast, and I don't like that because it's grabbing that transient. We don't actually want it to do that. All right, so what we're doing now, we're getting the compressor to leave that initial transient alone by picking a slower attack time. The compressor will start to come in after that first transient, so we don't lose the initial beta attack, okay? And listen what happens. All right, faster. Now we're really starting to get a bit more low end, and we're starting to get a bit too much saturation again, so I'm going to dial that back. I'll just level match. All right, cool. So let's once again export that out. So first off, we can see very much that we have altered the dynamic range of both of these kick drums. Okay, but they're starting to look a little different. Okay, got the original up the top, and then I'll swap them around. We've got the first compressed signal down in the middle, and then the most recent one down the bottom. Let's zoom in a little more to that kick drum and have a look at what we've done. Now what we can see in this one, okay, in the third one, is that first off, we've altered the attack a little bit, okay, and smoothed off, but then we've also, in a much greater way, started to turn up this sustain again. Okay, so we've got more sustain by adjusting the release, okay, to where we wanted it and getting the attack and release right. We've been able to maybe not so harshly compress this against the rest of the dynamic range, but we've definitely brought up that sustain section there. As we zoom in further along the track, you can definitely see that sustain much more pronounced here. And then you can see that basically the ADSR has definitely been altered from the original up here. Okay, so we've definitely affected our sound envelope there. Okay, the attack, the decay, the sustain and release have definitely been altered. But interestingly, as we zoom in, we start to see something different once again in our waveform. And I'll zoom in a little more. Let's see if we can see it a bit more pronounced. Okay. But basically, if you look at every little sampled part of this waveform, okay, we can see these little zigzags, okay, in the waveform. But if we come down to the one we added distortion to, they become a little bit more pronounced. And that is a sign of distortion being added. And I think they're much more obvious over here in the sustain portion. Look how smooth this waveform looks comparatively to this one, where it starts to get a lot more jaggedy. Okay, that is our distortion being added. So we've altered the ADSR envelope, the sound envelope of the original sound source, and then we've also added distortion and therefore more harmonics to the sound. So effectively, we are starting to change the timbre of the instrument. So if you understand, first of all, what we did last week, where we looked at controlling the dynamic range, and then combining that with the two things we learned today, that you can alter the sound envelope, the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release, and then on top of that, you can add harmonic distortion, you are really going to be shaping the timbre there. And you can use that in many different ways to create new sounds or help the original sound source fit better in the mix by changing its timbre, because that's really what we are doing with compressors. We are changing the timbre. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about compressors, that you're not just manipulating the dynamic range, you are manipulating the original timbre of the sound source. And in some cases you want to do that, but in other cases you might want to preserve the integrity of the original sound. So you've just got to keep that in mind. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just understanding how these tools work. Once again, as I spoke about last week, compressors are different tools. Okay, so you need to choose the right tool. Is the distressor compressor going to reshape the timbre the way you want? Or maybe there's a different compressor that might shape the sound of the kick drum in a better way. So for instance, if you wanted to get your kick drum to sit further forward in the mix, well, a lot of people know that compressors like the API compressors are very good for that. So maybe that's a choice. Or if you wanted more low end to your kick drum, maybe an SSL compressor, like a bus compressor, might be the compressor that you might want to use. Understanding that one compressor will change the envelope and the harmonics, so the timbre as a whole, the timbre of the original sound source in a different way to another compressor, is super, super important. And I think next week what we should do is look at all the different compressors and kind of compare how they alter the dynamic range and the timbre of the sound source in their own way and why that's so. So hopefully I'm starting to demystify and sort of help you better understand really what compressors do and how we can better use them to create better mixes. I hope you like this video. If you haven't already, please hit like, please hit subscribe. I'm Mitch from the DIYRecordingstudio.com, and I'll catch you soon.